The sun crept over the rolling plains, its
Let me
first
help you.
rays spilling
Don't
across
try
the
to handle
golden
everything on your
fields
own.
and low, broken fences that framed Rose's ranch. The old, weather-beaten barn, once echoing with laughter and the sound of boots stomping on wooden planks, now stood silent. Every morning since that night felt heavier, as if the earth itself was mourning the loss that had cracked Rose's world wide open. The echo of gunshots lingered in the air, seeping into the soil, refusing to be forgotten. Rose moved through the routines she once shared with her husband, Matthew. Each task, feeding the horses, mending the chicken coop, gathering eggs, felt like a test of will. She moved briskly, jaw set, determined not to let the sadness consume her, but it clung to her like a shadow. In the dim morning light, her face was streaked with dust, her hands calloused from years of working beside the man she loved. Now, every sound seemed louder, the wind sighing through the grass, the distant bellow of cattle, the sharp bark of a lone coyote. It had only been 2 weeks since Matthew was murdered in a violent dispute that rattled the entire county. The land grabbers, greedy for more than just acres, came in the dead of night. Voices low, faces masked, rifles drawn. Rose remembered that night in flashes, a lantern crashing, shouting, the thunderous report of guns, and then silence, blood on the floorboards. Her own voice, cracked and broken, screaming into the void as the men vanished into darkness, leaving her world shattered. The ranch, once lively and bustling, had turned cold and empty. Neighbors who'd once gathered around their table, sharing stories and warm bread, now kept their distance. The Carter brothers, infamous in the region for their ruthlessness, were behind the attack, everyone whispered. But fear kept tongues tied and windows shuttered. Rose saw the way folks glanced away when she passed through town, the way they hurried children inside and pretended not to notice her. Even the sheriff, who'd once tipped his hat to her and Matthew, now avoided her gaze, his allegiance shifting to wherever the Carter money flowed. The days blurred together. Rose barely slept. Nightmares haunted her, mixing memory and terror. Matthew's face, pale and slack, the metallic scent of blood, the sound of heavy boots stomping away. She'd wake before dawn, sweating and shaken, clutching the old quilt to her chest as if she could hold on to the past just a little longer. But this morning, as she stepped outside, the sun was especially bright. The sky burned with a clarity that made everything seem sharper. The green of the pasture, the red dust on her boots, the battered gravestone she'd carved herself at the edge of the property. She walked out to the lone hill where Matthew lay. The headstone was simple. His name, the date, and a rough carving of a wild Mustang, his favorite symbol of freedom. Rose knelt, her skirts gathering dirt and morning dew, and pressed a trembling hand to the stone. "I won't let them win, Matthew," she whispered, voice thick with tears she refused to shed. "Our dreams won't die here. Not like this." A sudden gust of wind rustled the dry grass around her, carrying with it the scent of sage and dust. In that moment, Rose felt the weight of her loneliness, the suffocating silence that had swallowed up her life. She missed Matthew's steady voice, the warmth of his hands, his laughter rolling over the plains. She missed the certainty of a future they'd planned together, expanding the ranch, maybe raising a family, growing old under the endless western sky. As she stood, a flicker of movement caught her eye. Far off, near the road, a black wagon lingered, Carter's men, no doubt, watching, always watching. Rose's heart pounded. She squared her shoulders, refusing to show fear, and marched back to the house. Every window in her home had become an eye, every creak a warning. She checked the lock on the barn, double-knotted the rope around the front gate, and scanned the horizon for dust trails that meant trouble was coming. Inside, the house was too quiet. The old clock ticked loudly in the kitchen. A faded photograph of her and Matthew hung above the fireplace, their smiles frozen in time. Rose forced herself to eat a little breakfast, cold biscuits and coffee gone bitter, but couldn't choke down much. There were chores to do, and she threw herself into them, working harder than ever, as if she could sweat out the sorrow and fear. Throughout the day, small troubles mounted. The south fence had fresh cuts in the wire, as if someone wanted the cattle to wander. One of the chickens had vanished, leaving a trail of feathers toward the creek. The pump handle stuck, and the trough was nearly dry, though Rose remembered filling it the night before. Each problem felt like another jab from an invisible hand, a reminder that she was under siege, alone. But Rose refused to back down. She patched the fence, reset the traps, and fixed the pump, sweat stinging her eyes. As the sun sank low, turning the sky to molten gold, she found herself standing at the edge of the property, hands on her hips, defiance simmering beneath her grief. That night, as darkness settled over the ranch, Rose sat by the window, rifle across her knees. She watched the moon climb, listened for footsteps in the yard, and thought about the life she'd had and the future she was determined to fight for. She was no longer just a widow. She was the keeper of a promise, the last line of defense against the darkness closing in. The world outside her window was dangerous, filled with men who believed they could take whatever they wanted, as long as they had enough bullets and fear on their side. But Rose had something they didn't: resolve forged by love and loss, and a vow whispered over a fresh grave. And as the first coyotes howled in the distance, she swore that come what may, she would not let the sun rise on a world where her dreams had died. Not without a fight. The days that followed grew darker, each one heavy with the tension that clung to the land like a low-hanging storm. The horizon always seemed to carry a sense of warning, as if the plains themselves could sense the danger closing in. Rose woke every morning to the feeling of being watched. Her neighbors, once her friends and allies, now kept their distance, their doors firmly shut, their eyes avoiding hers when she passed in town. The ranch had become an island, cut off from the world by the fear and silence spreading through the community. It was barely midday when the Carter brothers made their first appearance at Rose's ranch. They arrived without warning, the thunder of hooves and the creak of saddles breaking the uneasy calm. The two men rode tall and mean, with the same crooked smirks they wore when they'd swaggered through town to collect debts or lay down threats. Their eyes, sharp and cold, scanned the property as if it already belonged to them. Without a word, they dismounted and strode toward the house, boots pounding the porch boards. Rose watched them approach, her heartbeat steady but hard. She met them at the door, refusing to retreat even a step. There was a strange calm in her chest, the quiet steel of a woman with nothing left to lose. She didn't need to hear their threats to know what they wanted. The Carter brothers were known across the county for their greed and their willingness to do anything to get what they wanted. They laid out their demand with cruel simplicity: sell the land, pack her things, and leave by the end of the week. They offered a price that was a mockery of the ranch's worth, barely enough for a train ticket out of town. Rose's refusal was quiet but unwavering. She shook her head, her eyes steady, her voice flat. The Carters didn't bother to hide their contempt. They promised she'd regret her decision, spat in the dirt at her feet, and stalked away, leaving the stench of menace in their wake. That night, as the moon rose, the threats became more than words. The sound of glass shattering ripped through the darkness, echoing across the empty yard. Rose raced to the kitchen to find her window smashed. Cold wind and dust pouring in. The next morning, she found the south fence cut again, the wire dangling like a wound. 2 cows had vanished, their tracks leading off into the wild scrubland. The barn doors were hanging open, tools scattered across the floor as if someone had ransacked the place searching for something to steal or sabotage. Every morning brought new damages. Fresh footprints by the well, another chicken missing. The vegetable garden trampled under heavy boots. The steady drip of trouble was designed to wear her down, to push her toward surrender by degrees. Rose worked from dawn until well after dark, patching, repairing, locking everything she could. But exhaustion was setting in, and for every fix, there seemed to be 2 new problems waiting for her by sunrise. Desperation finally drove her into town, seeking help from the one man who was supposed to stand for justice, Sheriff Miller. She found him at his desk in the cramped, cluttered office, boots propped up and hat pulled low over his eyes. The badge on his vest caught the light, but there was no warmth in his expression when she pleaded her case. He listened with a blank face, barely feigning interest as she explained the threats, the vandalism, the missing livestock. When she finished, he leaned forward, folding his hands on the scarred desk, and told her to take the Carter brothers' offer. "It's not worth the trouble, Rose," he said, his tone as flat and cold as the iron bars on the jail cell behind him. "You can always start again somewhere else." She realized then that the rumors were true. The sheriff was deep in Carter's pocket, his authority nothing but a hollow badge. There would be no help from him, no intervention, no hope for justice. She left his office feeling colder and more alone than ever, the townspeople watching her through half-open windows as she walked back to her wagon. Back at the ranch, Rose let herself break down for the first time since Matthew's death. She collapsed by the kitchen table, head in her hands, and let the sobs shake her body, grief mixed with anger, exhaustion blending with despair. But even as the tears fell, something else burned inside her, a stubborn, flickering ember of defiance. The ranch was her home. It held every memory she had left of Matthew, every dream they had built together. If the Carters thought she would run, they didn't know her at all. From that moment, Rose steeled herself for what was coming. She doubled her efforts, sleeping less and working harder, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Nights became a game of nerves, listening for footsteps in the dark, shotgun never far from her reach. She rode the fence lines at dawn, marking every break and fixing what she could. Fear was a constant companion, but so was the determination to survive. The attacks escalated. Windows shattered again, fences were ripped apart. The herd grew smaller each week. Even the old ranch dog limped with a fresh wound one morning, his side bloodied by a thrown rock. The Carters had turned the community against her, and now Rose stood truly alone. But she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her defeated. If this land was to be taken, it would not be surrendered easily. As another sun set and Rose finished yet another round of repairs, she paused by the gravestone on the hill. The plains stretched out before her, the sky ablaze with streaks of orange and violet. The Carter brothers thought they could scare her off, but they'd underestimated the resolve of a woman who'd lost everything and still stood her ground. Rose pressed her palm to the cold stone, whispering another promise to Matthew and to herself. She would not abandon their dreams, not to greed, not to fear, and not to men who mistook cruelty for strength. Whatever storm was coming, she would face it, battered but unbowed. And as the first stars pierced the night, Rose squared her shoulders and turned back toward the house, ready to fight another day. The wind changed with the season, bringing cooler nights and the promise of rain that rarely came. Each day, Rose's work grew heavier, her body aching, her spirit worn thin by the relentless strain. Yet even as fatigue threatened to break her, she kept moving, driven by pride, stubbornness, and the memory of the life she had lost. She stopped expecting help from anyone. The world had turned its back, leaving her to face the darkness alone. It was on one such evening, as storm clouds piled up in the west and the sky turned the color of bruised steel, that a stranger rode up the dusty lane to Rose's battered gate. The sun was dipping low, painting the ranch in fiery hues, and Rose, mending fence wire near the barn, noticed the lone rider long before he drew close. Her heart kicked at the sight. A figure slouched in the saddle, hat pulled low, dust rising behind him like a specter. These days, every visitor was a threat until proven otherwise. She watched, hidden behind the broken fence, her shotgun gripped tight as the rider slowed his horse and stopped at the gate. He didn't call out. Instead, he sat in the gathering gloom, the lines of his face lost to shadow, waiting for her to make the first move. Only when the storm's first fat raindrops began to fall did Rose step forward, her eyes wary but unyielding. The man dismounted, moving with the slow, deliberate grace of someone used to hard roads and bad weather. He led his horse by the reins, his boots leaving deep prints in the muddy earth. Lightning flickered on the horizon, illuminating a worn coat, a battered hat, and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of a dozen lifetimes. He paused just outside the yard, close enough for Rose to see the exhaustion in his stance, but far enough to show he meant no harm. Rose's mind raced as she studied him. Then, through the haze of rain and memory, she realized she'd seen this man before. Not long ago, during a different season, when the ranch was alive with promise, he'd come through, helping her and Matthew corral a wild Mustang that had broken free during a spring thunderstorm. He'd asked for nothing in return, disappearing as quietly as he'd arrived, the kind of drifter the land occasionally spat out, rootless, solitary, hardened by loss. Now he stood before her again, his presence both a comfort and a mystery. Rose lowered her shotgun, the tension in her shoulders easing but not vanishing. The man spoke softly, voice low and rough from the trail, asking if she needed help or at least shelter from the coming storm. For a heartbeat, pride warred with desperation inside her. She was used to refusing charity, yet tonight, something in his manner, the quiet respect, the way he waited for her invitation, reminded her that even the strongest needed a respite sometimes. She nodded, letting him tie his horse in the barn and join her on the porch. As thunder rolled overhead, she fetched a spare blanket and some stale cornbread from the kitchen. The drifter thanked her with a nod, not pressing her with questions or stories, content to let the rain do the talking. In that silence, Rose felt the loneliness inside her loosen its grip, just a little. She introduced herself, and the man replied with a name. Jack. It suited him, plain, unadorned, as if carved out of the land itself. They didn't speak of the trouble that hovered around the ranch, but Jack's eyes caught the shattered window, the battered locks, and the scars on her hands. Without asking, he rolled up his sleeves and set to work. helping to secure the barn door against the wind, fixing a loose shutter, checking the fence line with practiced efficiency. Over the next days, Jack settled into a rhythm beside her. He worked from dawn to dusk, never complaining, moving through chores as if he'd always belonged. Rose watched him closely, how he handled the horses with a quiet authority, how he spoke little but noticed everything, how he never turned his back to the open plain, always alert for danger. There was a haunted quality to him, a sadness that echoed her own, though he kept whatever stories he carried close to his chest. Some in town noticed Jack's arrival. Rumors began to swirl about the widow with the mysterious hired hand, about Jack's past, about what kind of man would choose to stay at a place like Rose's, so clearly marked by trouble. The Carter brothers didn't like the change in the wind. They watched the ranch from a distance, their anger simmering, their threats growing bolder. But with Jack's presence, a subtle shift took hold. The ranch no longer felt entirely vulnerable. Rose found herself sleeping a little better, knowing someone else was watching the darkness with her. Jack was no savior, and Rose didn't expect one. But together, their partnership, born of necessity and sharpened by adversity, made both stronger. One evening, after patching another broken section of fence, Jack paused and glanced toward the distant hills, where storm clouds gathered like armies preparing for war. The future was still uncertain, the threats far from over. But for the first time since Matthew's death, hope flickered in Rose's heart, not as a wild, naive thing, but as a small, stubborn flame. There was a long road ahead, and many battles left to fight. Yet with Jack's quiet strength beside her, Rose felt just a little less alone as night crept in and the land held its breath for whatever would come next. The days passed in a tense, wary rhythm, marked by the grinding labor of survival and the ever-present sense that they were being watched. Rose and Jack became a team, out of necessity first, and then something deeper, born of shared silence and a stubborn refusal to let the land be taken. The ranch, though battered, began to feel alive again, as if the energy Jack brought infused the broken boards and neglected fields with new determination. From the first light of dawn, they worked side by side. Jack patched up the worst of the fences with what little wire they had left, his hands sure and efficient. Rose, never one to stand idly by, learned to set traps and repair damage as quickly as it was inflicted. Each day brought fresh evidence of sabotage: fence posts uprooted, water barrels slashed, a dead calf by the creek. It was as if the Carter brothers wanted to bleed the ranch dry through 1,000 tiny wounds rather than a single killing blow. As Jack settled in, he began to share the skills that had kept him alive on the open road. He taught Rose how to shoot: steady hands, slow breath, eyes narrowed against the late afternoon glare. They set up targets on the far fence line, the echo of gunshots mingling with the whistle of the wind. Jack's instructions were brief and calm, his patience never wavering, and Rose surprised herself with how quickly she learned. The weight of the rifle in her arms no longer felt foreign or frightening. It was a tool, a shield, something she could rely on. Beyond the lessons in defense, Jack taught her how to read tracks in the dirt, how to spot the signs of trespassers: boot prints near the barn, broken twigs along the cattle path, the strange hush of birds that meant men were near. They moved through the days with a new sense of alertness, eyes scanning for danger, always preparing for the next move. Each night, they checked the locks and lit a lamp in the front window, a quiet signal to anyone watching that the ranch was no longer defenseless. Rumors about Rose's new hired hand spread quickly through the town. Some folks whispered that Jack was a wanted man, running from his past, while others insisted he was an outlaw brought in to fight fire with fire. The Carter brothers in particular bristled at the idea that Rose was receiving outside help. Their gang rode by the edge of the property at sunset, their laughter carrying across the fields, a clear message that trouble was never far. Inside the house, Rose felt the pressure building. She moved through the rooms with a purpose, cataloging every possible weakness. The windows were reinforced with planks nailed crosswise, the doors braced at night. She slept with the rifle by her bed and kept a knife hidden under her pillow. It was no way to live, she knew, but there was no alternative. Every day was a fight to keep her home intact, to honor the memory of what she and Matthew had built. Despite the threat outside, a fragile sense of companionship grew between Rose and Jack. They didn't talk much about the past. Pain had made both of them wary, but small gestures spoke volumes. A cup of coffee left steaming on the table at dawn, a dry blanket after a stormy night. The way Jack fixed the loose porch step without being asked, or how Rose cooked an extra portion of stew, sliding the bowl toward him in quiet thanks. In the stillness of evening, when the chores were finally done and the sky turned the color of old bruises, they sometimes sat together on the porch, watching the last of the sun sink behind the hills. In those moments, surrounded by the low hum of cicadas and the soft clatter of the wind, the world outside seemed, just for a heartbeat, at peace. But the peace never lasted. One morning, Rose found the well fouled, a dead rabbit floating in the water, the stench overwhelming. That night, a figure crept near the barn, scattering the horses and leaving a length of rope tied like a noose over the gate. The message was clear. The Carters wanted her gone, and they would not stop until she broke. Tensions reached a fever pitch when Jack discovered footprints circling the chicken coop and a fresh cigarette stub pressed into the mud, something none of the ranch hands, past or present, would ever smoke. They tracked the prints to the edge of the property and found a discarded hat, stained and torn, unmistakably belonging to one of the Carter men. It was a warning, left out in the open for them to find. Rose's nerves grew taut as wire. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind sent her heart racing. Yet she refused to let fear win. With Jack's steady presence, her determination only sharpened. Together, they became the guardians of the land, their partnership forged in adversity, tempered by fire. Each act of sabotage only fueled their resolve, binding them closer, preparing them for whatever darkness the Carter brothers might bring next. As another week faded into the dust and Rose stood watch beneath a sky streaked with silver stars, she felt something unexpected: pride. Not just in surviving, but in fighting back. The ranch would not fall quietly, and for the first time since Matthew's death, hope didn't seem foolish at all. It felt like defiance, bright and unbreakable, shining through the long, uncertain night. The days rolled into each other, tense and restless, as if the entire world was holding its breath. Each morning, Rose woke with a new bruise on her spirit, the result of endless small skirmishes, another cut fence, a missing tool, a water trough overturned in the night. But she and Jack met every fresh insult with stubborn energy. Every blow from the Carter gang was met with repairs, barricades, and a growing determination not to be chased off. But the Carter brothers were not men who believed in patience or subtlety forever. One night, when the moon hung sharp and pale over the plain, Their rage flared into open violence. It began with the sudden, terrifying bellow of livestock from the barn. Rose was jerked awake, adrenaline racing through her veins. She snatched up the rifle from beside her bed and rushed outside, Jack only a half step behind her. The air was thick with smoke, a low orange glow lighting up the night from the direction of the barn. For a split second, Rose's mind refused to believe what her eyes told her. Her barn, the heart of the ranch, was on fire. Flames licked at the wooden beams, already hungry and climbing higher. The shrill screams of terrified horses and the frantic lowing of cattle filled the air, the animals thrashing inside their pens, blinded by fear and heat. Jack was the first to leap into action, wrenching open the big doors as Rose scrambled to untie the panicked animals. The fire roared, feeding on dry timber, hay, and old oil rags. Inside the barn, heat pressed in like a living thing. Smoke stung Rose's eyes and made every breath hurt, but she forced herself to move fast, her fingers working blindly as she freed horses, throwing open gates, her voice lost in the roar. Jack drove the cattle out, swinging wide the back gate with a strength Rose didn't know he had. They stumbled through the swirling haze, shoving and coaxing the animals into the yard, just ahead of the crackling collapse of the roof. For a moment, it seemed like the world might burn down around them, the flames so bright they turned the night into noon. When it was over, the barn was little more than a pile of smoldering black timbers. The livestock, frightened but alive, clustered in the far field. Jack and Rose slumped against the fence, their faces streaked with soot, their bodies shaking from exertion and relief. The air was filled with the acrid scent of charred wood and singed hair. For a long moment, neither spoke. There was nothing to say. As dawn crept across the scorched yard, the full extent of the loss became clear. They had saved most of the animals, but supplies, feed, tools, medicines, the last of their winter hay, had all gone up in smoke. The barn, built by Matthew and his father years ago, was destroyed. Rose's hands shook as she sifted through the ashes, finding only warped metal, shattered glass, and ruined memories. The neighbors had seen the flames from miles away. Lantern lights flickered at the edges of the property, and Rose thought for a moment that help might finally arrive. But no one came. Fear had settled too deeply over the community. Nobody wanted to risk the Carter brothers' anger by getting involved. The silence of her neighbors was almost worse than the violence of her enemies. It felt like a betrayal, one more wound carved into her heart. For the first time since Matthew's murder, Rose wavered. She looked out across the ruined yard and felt something inside her go cold and hollow. The Carter's message was clear: leave or lose everything. She wondered if maybe she should give in, pack what she could, and run before the darkness claimed everything she loved. But it was Jack who kept her from falling. He found her sitting on the back steps at dawn, her face blank and her eyes red. Without a word, he handed her a tin cup of coffee, bitter and black, and sat beside her as the new day began. The two of them, alone in the aftermath, shared a silence that was not defeat, but stubbornness. Jack's calm steadied her. His presence, so solid and unwavering, reminded her of the vow she'd made at Matthew's grave. She could not let the Carters win. Not now. Not ever. That morning, as the sun rose over the blackened skeleton of the barn, Rose felt her resolve harden. The Carters expected her to fight like a cornered animal, defending what was left, lashing out in desperation. But she realized that brute force would never win against men who held the town in fear. She needed to think, to plan, to outsmart them. She and Jack spent the day salvaging what they could, but as they worked, ideas took root. They began to talk, quiet, fierce conversations about how the Carters operated, who they bribed, what they feared. Jack's experiences from a life on the move gave him insight into the weaknesses of gangs and bullies. Rose knew the people of the valley, the way the town's quiet gossip worked, the secrets folks tried to keep. Slowly they started building a new kind of defense. Not just fences and guns, but strategies and traps. They wrote down every strange visitor, every shadow seen at the edge of the ranch. Jack followed the Carter brothers' men into town, watching and listening, gathering information. Rose reached out, cautiously, to a few neighbors who still remembered what it meant to stand together, planting the seeds of a resistance that might one day grow into something stronger. But for now, their world had shrunk to a circle of firelight and ash. The barn was gone, but hope, battered and battered again, refused to die. Rose understood now that her real battle wasn't just against the Carters, but against despair itself. As she walked the charred ruins under the cold morning sky, she made a silent promise to Matthew, to herself, and to Jack beside her. She would never let fear make her small. If she had to rebuild with her bare hands, she would do it. If she had to fight alone, she would not back down. In the heart of devastation, something new was taking shape, a courage born of fire and loss, a stubborn dream that would not burn away. After the fire, the days grew sharper, colder in the mornings, hotter in the afternoons, the wind always restless, swirling ashes and memories alike. The loss of the barn was a wound that bled into every hour, but Rose and Jack refused to let it become the final blow. They threw themselves into salvaging what they could from the charred rubble, reusing boards and nails, making do with less, patching over the holes that loss had left. Survival had become a matter of planning, not just endurance, but the Carters had not finished with them. The attacks grew sly, more calculated. One morning, Rose found a fresh set of boot prints by the tool shed, and a thin sheet of paper nailed to the door, bearing the official seal of the county. According to the document, the ranch now legally belonged to the Carter brothers. The signature at the bottom was the sheriff's. It was Jack who spotted the forgery first. The language was stiff and awkward, the ink still fresh. He squinted at the document, then at the tracks in the dirt. He explained how, in his travels, he'd seen men try to steal land with lies as much as bullets. Rose's anger simmered beneath her calm as she took in the evidence. The Carters had moved from threats and violence to fraud. They were trying to win with paper what they hadn't yet seized with fire and fear. Determined not to surrender, Rose and Jack set out to gather proof of the Carters' crimes. Jack spent evenings in the back rooms of saloons, listening to loose talk and careless boasts. He paid attention to the men who drank too much and talked too loudly about forged papers and payoffs. Rose, meanwhile, visited the town's notary under the guise of routine business, quietly confirming that the land deed was still in her name. She left with a copy of the records, tucked deep in her coat, her hands trembling with equal parts relief and fury. With every fact they collected, the Carters' scheme became clearer. They had bribed the sheriff, forged signatures, and intimidated officials, betting that fear would keep anyone from speaking up. But Rose and Jack weren't afraid to fight back. They began to document everything: names, dates, threats, and every scrap of evidence that pointed to the conspiracy. The tension in town reached a breaking point when Jack confronted the sheriff. It happened on the main street, under the watchful eyes of townsfolk who'd once looked away. Jack's words cut sharp and clear, accusing the sheriff of taking bribes and betraying the people he was meant to protect. The sheriff, red-faced and sweating, tried to laugh it off, but the crowd was listening. Someone muttered agreement. Someone else spat at the ground in disgust. The old fear that had ruled the town was beginning to crack. That night, as a storm rolled in over the hills, the Carter brothers made their move. They gathered their gang and rode out for the ranch, rifles glinting in the torchlight, intent on finishing what they'd started. Jack and Rose saw them coming, their torches bobbing like angry fireflies along the ridge. The standoff had arrived, sudden but inevitable. Inside the battered house, Jack checked the rifle and counted the shells. Rose loaded the old shotgun, her hands steady now, her mind as clear as the night air. They moved with quiet purpose, barricading the doors and windows, scattering broken glass along the porch, tying up the livestock out of harm's way. There was no time for fear, only resolve. The first shots rang out as the Carters reached the front gate. Bullets splintered the fence, shattered a window, sent Rose's heart racing in her chest. She and Jack fired back, careful and precise, aiming to wound, to warn, to show that the ranch would not fall without a fight. The Carters' men pressed closer, emboldened by numbers, but the defenses held, barrels upturned as cover, lanterns snuffed to confuse the attackers, the livestock herded to safety in the farthest field. The battle raged for what felt like hours, though it could only have been minutes. The air filled with smoke and shouts, the crack of gunfire, the thudding of boots on dry earth. Rose moved from room to room, checking every window, eyes burning with determination. Jack's silhouette flashed at her side, quick and silent, covering every angle, never letting the Carters' men get close. A lull fell as the Carters regrouped, shouting orders to fall back and try another approach. Jack and Rose used the precious seconds to breathe, to check wounds, to brace for the next assault. Rain began to fall, turning dust to mud, smothering the flames of torches and making the night even darker. But in that darkness, Rose felt something shift. The fear that had once held the ranch captive was breaking, driven out by anger, hope, and the fierce need to survive. With a final, furious rush, the Carters' men charged the front steps, but Jack and Rose stood their ground. The gunfire echoed across the valley, a warning and a promise. By the time the storm passed, the Carters' gang was retreating, their pride battered as much as their bodies. The ranch, though scarred and battered, had held. Inside the house, Rose leaned against the wall, breathing hard, sweat and rain mingling on her brow. Jack looked at her, exhausted but alive, and the two shared a nod of grim satisfaction. The battle was far from over. But tonight, at least, they had turned the tide, and as dawn broke over the wounded land, Rose realized that this fight was more than just for property or memory. It was for the right to stand, unbroken, on the ground she called home. Morning came slowly after the violent standoff, painting the battered ranch in faint shades of hope. The yard was littered with empty shells, torn earth, and broken planks. But the ranch itself still stood, bloodied but unbowed. For the first time since Matthew's death, Rose allowed herself to stand on the porch in the pale gold light and breathe without trembling. The Carters had not won. The fear that had stalked the ranch for weeks had been driven back, if only for a night. But as the smoke cleared, something began to change, almost imperceptibly, in the valley beyond the ranch. Word of the battle spread quickly through the town and outlying farms. How Rose and Jack had stood their ground against the Carter brothers and their gang. How they had refused to bow to violence or threats. How they had survived where so many would have run. In kitchens and barns, on back porches and dusty roads, the story was retold, colored with admiration, respect, and finally, a touch of courage. At first, it was just a handful of neighbors, men and women who remembered better days, who had once eaten at Matthew and Rose's table or borrowed tools from their shed. They arrived at the ranch quietly, bringing what they could spare, an armful of boards, a sack of flour, a few old nails, and a solemn promise to help. These were not warriors, but folks who had grown tired of living in fear and shame. Each one, by their presence, chipped away at the isolation that the Carters had used as a weapon. Jack greeted them with a nod, showing them where repairs were needed. Rose, still wary but deeply grateful, accepted their help, her heart swelling with something she had not felt in months: belonging. The community's presence was not loud or showy, but in every plank hammered and every fence repaired, there was a sense of reclaiming something stolen by violence, the right to stand together. The Carter brothers, watching from the ridge, did not like what they saw. Their power, built on intimidation and division, was suddenly threatened by something far more dangerous: unity. They sent threats and warnings, but now, instead of shrinking away, the people of the valley began to whisper back. Old feuds were set aside. Neighbors began to watch out for each other, passing word along the grapevine whenever the Carters' men were seen riding near someone's land. Meanwhile, Jack continued gathering evidence. He met quietly with townsfolk, encouraging those who had been bullied or bribed to come forward. With Rose's help, he compiled a growing ledger of stories, receipts, and statements, all pointing to the Carter brothers' reign of fear and the sheriff's complicity. Some nights, he rode out to neighboring farms, speaking in hushed tones to men who had once worked for the Carters, but had grown tired of their cruelty. Bit by bit, the truth took shape, hard as iron and impossible to ignore. The turning point came when a young ranch hand, beaten and left for dead by the Carters after refusing to torch Rose's fields, crawled to the ranch for help. Rose nursed his wounds, and in return, he told all he knew: names, dates, secret deals, and the hiding place of the Carter brothers' forged documents. It was the missing piece. With trembling hands, Jack collected the evidence, and at dawn, rode with a growing crowd behind him straight into town. The main street was hushed as Jack, Rose, and the battered young man confronted the sheriff. Rose stood tall, her grief and anger forged into quiet strength, as Jack laid the evidence before the townsfolk. The sheriff, faced with the weight of his own corruption, tried to bluster and threaten, but the people had had enough. The crowd swelled, voices rose demanding justice. At last, the law, real law, not the Carters' version, snapped back into place. The sheriff was stripped of his badge and driven from town, chased by jeers and thrown stones. The Carter brothers, realizing their hold had broken, tried to run, but they were seized by the men and women they had terrorized for years. The arrests came swiftly. The gang rounded up and paraded through the streets under watchful eyes. For the first time in memory, the town stood together, united not by fear, but by defiance and hope. As dusk settled over the valley, a bonfire was lit in the center of the main street, and the people gathered to watch the last of the Carters' men marched away in chains. Back at the ranch, the night was quieter than any Rose could remember. The shadows that had pressed in so tightly now seemed to retreat, replaced by the glow of lanterns and the laughter of neighbors sharing bread and stories. Rose sat on the porch, Jack beside her and let the exhaustion wash over her. She looked out at the land she had fought for, the faces of those who had finally stood with her, and felt a peace she'd thought forever lost. The past could not be undone, and the scars of violence would linger. But the future was no longer something to dread. The tide had turned, and hope, once battered and fragile, now shone strong as the evening star over the western sky. The days after the Carter brothers' downfall were filled with a cautious, unfamiliar peace. For so long, the ranch had been a fortress under siege, every sunrise bringing new trouble, every sunset leaving a bitter taste of uncertainty. Now, for the first time in months, Rose could step outside without glancing over her shoulder, could breathe the morning air without the ache of fear constricting her chest. But the scars of battle, on the land, on her body, in her heart, ran deep. The barn's ashes had cooled, leaving only a blackened outline where a lifetime of memories had stood. Fences still needed mending. Fields were ragged, the livestock thin from nights of panic and days without proper shelter. Yet, as she walked the property with Jack, the quiet that hung over the ranch was no longer the hush of dread, but the gentle, uncertain hush of recovery. Neighbors came daily, bringing planks and nails, rope and feed. Some brought more than supplies: loaves of bread, jars of preserves, a jug of strong coffee, or a sack of seeds for next spring's planting. A few, awkward and apologetic, offered only their time and their hands, eager to atone for the weeks when fear had kept them away. Rose accepted each gesture, big and small, with a nod of gratitude. The hurt of their earlier absence lingered, but she understood how terror could paralyze a person's soul. Now she chose to focus on the present, on the efforts to rebuild not only her ranch, but the bonds that made a community whole. Jack worked tirelessly, his sleeves rolled up, and his focus unwavering. He was everywhere, swinging a hammer atop a new barn frame, leading horses back to their paddock, showing the younger boys how to set a fence post true and square. He hardly spoke of his past, but there was a steadiness to his actions, a quiet humility that inspired those around him. The townsfolk came to trust him, their suspicions of the hired drifter dissolving each day he stood beside Rose, helping restore what had been lost. Evenings brought a new kind of quiet, a sense of calm earned rather than imposed. After long days of labor, folks lingered on the porch, sharing stories beneath a sky streaked with the last gold of summer. The children, drawn by the novelty of peace, raced each other through the fields and explored the half-built barn. Laughter returned to the valley, tentative at first, then swelling with each retelling of the Carter brothers' defeat. No one dared say the word safe yet, but the weight pressing down on everyone's hearts had lifted. Rose moved through these days like someone waking from a long, hard sleep. Her grief for Matthew remained, a dull ache that surfaced when she least expected it, triggered by the sight of his old hat on a hook or the memory of his hand on her shoulder. But the bitterness had faded, replaced by a bittersweet acceptance. She tended Matthew's grave, not with the old tears of anger and loss, but with gentle conversation, recounting the progress of the ranch, the courage of their friends, and the surprising comfort she found in Jack's company. Jack, for his part, changed too. Where once he'd kept to the edges, ready to ride on at the first sign of trouble, he now found himself rooted. He joined the men for coffee at dawn, his laugh growing more frequent, his stories, carefully chosen, making their way into the fabric of community life. He fixed things that didn't need fixing, checked the livestock twice as often, and always managed to be there when Rose faltered, offering support without words. One afternoon, as Rose watched him lead a skittish foal into the new barn, she realized the fear that had driven her every thought had been replaced by hope. Not the wild hope of a young bride, but a grown woman's hope, battered but enduring. The land around her was still marked by battle, but green shoots pushed through the blackened soil, and the air was filled with the honest sounds of people working, building, laughing again. As autumn deepened, a harvest of sorts came due, not just in the fields, but in the hearts of everyone who'd suffered under the Carters' reign. The town held a gathering, simple but heartfelt, to celebrate the end of fear and the beginning of something new. Rose was surprised when she was asked to say a few words, but standing before friends and neighbors, she found her voice steady. She spoke not only of survival, but of forgiveness, resilience, and the stubborn power of standing together. That night, as she walked home beneath the stars, Jack at her side, Rose felt the burdens of the past slipping away, replaced by something brighter. She had let go of the worst of her grief, making room for new dreams. Dreams not of what was lost, but of what might still be built. The ranch was not yet whole, but it was healing. And in the quiet warmth of a home rebuilt from ashes, surrounded by friends and a sense of belonging, Rose discovered a truth as wide as the western sky. Even the deepest wounds could be mended, and hope, like the land itself, could be coaxed back to life with patience, courage, and the willingness to try again. Autumn settled fully into the valley, bringing with it a gentle hush and a gold-tinged beauty that Rose had not noticed in years. The land, once scarred by fire and fear, now stretched green and calm beneath the changing sky. Days grew crisp and evenings brisk, yet warmth flickered everywhere. Smoke curling from rebuilt chimneys, laughter rolling across fields where grass once withered beneath the Carters' threats. The past lingered, but it no longer held the power to shadow every step. The ranch itself transformed, shaped by 100 careful hands and quiet acts of kindness. What began as a necessity, neighbors pitching in, lending tools, sharing what little they could spare, became habit. The new barn, though smaller than the old one, stood sturdy and proud, its timbers hewn from trees felled during a winter storm many years before. The fences, now stronger, traced the property's boundary with a stubborn precision, a silent testament to resilience. Rose woke each morning before the dawn, slipping from warm quilts and into a rhythm she had nearly forgotten, feeding livestock, checking fences, tending to the slow, hopeful work of planting winter wheat. Jack was already up most days, building a new paddock or mending equipment, always humming a low tune as he worked. The ranch dog, once fearful and gaunt, now wagged his tail with cautious joy, trailing after the pair as they moved from task to task. A gentle transformation bloomed between Rose and Jack, too, as natural as spring water bubbling up after a hard frost. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic moment. Instead, affection grew in the soft looks shared across the dinner table, in the silent teamwork of difficult chores, in the way Jack's hand lingered on Rose's shoulder when she was weary. In the evenings, when the sky burned violet and the world grew quiet, they would sit together on the porch steps, their silence companionable. The ache of grief now replaced by the fragile but real pulse of hope. Word of their partnership, first as ranchers, then as something deeper, spread through the community as gently as the dawn. Those who had once kept their distance now nodded in greeting, offered warm smiles, and treated the ranch as a gathering place. Evenings grew lively with neighbors stopping by, bearing gifts of food or news. Laughter, real, unforced laughter, became a fixture once more. Children returned to the fields, chasing dogs and each other through tall grass. Old feuds faded, and the boundaries that fear had built began to erode, replaced by mutual trust. One crisp afternoon, Rose and Jack decided to host a small celebration. It was less a party than a thank you, a gathering of those who had refused to let darkness win. The tables were set up outside, laden with bread, roasted meat, and steaming stew. Rose wore a faded dress that had once been reserved for Sundays, her hair pinned up but stubbornly refusing to stay in place. Jack, awkward in a freshly laundered shirt, tried not to fidget as the first guests arrived, their laughter bubbling up as naturally as water from the well. Neighbors filled the yard, filling the air with stories of hardship and recovery. Some of the oldest residents, who remembered when Matthew first brought Rose to the ranch, raised glasses in quiet tribute to the journey she had taken. From hopeful bride to battered widow, from survivor to leader, and finally, to a woman forging a new path with a partner at her side. The mood was not triumphant, but honest, marked by tears as much as by smiles, by the memory of what was lost and the gratitude for what had been regained. As the sun set and lanterns lit the shadows, Rose found herself standing with Jack at the edge of the gathering. The fields stretched out before them, shimmering with the last gold of the day, and the ranch bustled behind, alive with music and the gentle noise of belonging. She looked at Jack, saw the steadiness in his gaze, and felt her heart swell with something new, a quiet certainty that whatever storms might come, she would not face them alone. That night, as the last guests drifted home and the yard fell silent, Rose and Jack lingered on the porch, watching the stars emerge above the rolling hills. The hardships of the past year lingered in their memories, but their weight had lessened. In its place was the steady, hopeful beat of a future they were shaping together. In the weeks that followed, this sense of new beginnings only deepened. The ranch, once a symbol of sorrow, became a place of gathering and growth. Jack built a new corral with the help of local boys, while Rose tended a row of apple trees she'd planted in the yard, a living promise of seasons to come. The townsfolk, having found their courage, looked to the ranch as a reminder of what could be accomplished when people stood together. And so, life began again, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, persistent work of everyday living. With each sunrise, Rose felt the pain of her old wounds ease a little more. She allowed herself to dream of things she once thought lost, of laughter echoing in the house, of children's voices, of a peace that could last. The future was no longer something to fear, but a bright, open road unfolding beneath a wide and forgiving sky. Months slipped by, measured not by conflict, but by the steady, quiet rhythm of living. The valley breathed easier, the land healing as surely as the people who called it home. Where once smoke and gunfire marked the days, now the sounds of hammers, laughter, and birdsong filled the ranch from sunup to sundown. Rose, who had so often braced herself for loss, learned to look forward to each dawn with a heart no longer clenched in fear. Winter, when it came, was gentle. Snow dusted the hills and roof lines. The cold air made chores brisk but never bitter. For the first time in years, Rose found herself embracing the slower pace. The house, once echoing with emptiness, now pulsed with warmth and comfort. Jack, her partner in every sense, filled the long evenings with stories and music, plucking an old guitar as the wind howled outside. Sometimes neighbors braved the icy road to share stew and laughter by lantern light, the walls of the little house soaking in every sound. It was during one such night, when the laughter faded and the fire settled low, that Rose allowed herself a long, grateful look around her home. Photographs lined the mantel. Her parents, Matthew, friends, and neighbors. Matthew's memory remained, woven into the fabric of her days, but it was no longer a wound. She spoke of him often, told stories to children who'd never met him, planting his kindness into a new generation. It was not letting go, she realized, but carrying forward. Jack was never far from her side. He fit into the rhythms of the ranch with quiet certainty, his strong hands as capable at mending hearts as they were at mending fences. Where once he'd been haunted by a past he never spoke of, now there was a peace in his gaze, a steadiness that matched her own. The two worked in companionable silence, sharing the burden and the joy of every day. In small, gentle moments, a glance across the breakfast table, the brushing of hands as they saddled horses, the soft laughter as they watched a new foal wobble on unsteady legs. Rose discovered the kind of love that did not need to be declared, only lived. The ranch itself flourished. By spring, fields once bare with grief now shimmered green and lush, a testament to stubborn hope. Wildflowers crept along the creek banks, and the apple trees Rose had planted burst into white blossoms, promising sweet fruit for the seasons ahead. The barn, rebuilt stronger and brighter, stood as a monument not only to hard work, but to the community that had come together in the darkest hour. Neighbors continued to visit, drawn by a sense of kinship, knowing that if hardship returned, they would face it together. Children raced through the tall grass, their laughter ringing out beneath the endless sky. The ranch dog, grayer now but content, guarded his territory with cheerful pride, his bark echoing across the hills. And in the evenings, when chores were done and the land glowed with the last gold of sunset, Rose and Jack would ride out together, side by side, the familiar rhythm of hooves, a reminder of everything they had survived. One peaceful dawn, Rose woke to the soft glow of sunrise spilling through the window. Jack lay beside her, his arm draped across her waist, their breaths moving in quiet sync. She slipped from the warmth of bed and padded to the porch, a mug of coffee warming her hands. The air was cool, sweet with the scent of dew and fresh grass. She stood for a long moment, watching as the first rays of light touched the fields, painting everything in gentle promise. She thought back to the dark days when hope had seemed an impossible luxury, when grief and violence had threatened to consume everything she loved. Those memories had shaped her, honed her resolve, but now they felt like old shadows, long and thin, easily banished by the rising sun. The pain remained, but it no longer defined her. Instead, she felt a quiet gratitude for the journey, for the strength she had found in herself and in those who stood beside her. Jack joined her on the porch, his presence calm and steady. Together, they watched the horses graze, the new barn standing proud, the smoke from breakfast fires curling into the brightening sky. There were always new challenges on the horizon: drought, hard winters, the unpredictable ways of life in the West. But Rose knew now that she would not face them alone. As the valley woke around them, Rose allowed herself a rare, unguarded smile. The future stretched wide and unknown, but she faced it with open eyes, anchored by the land and the love she had reclaimed. Whatever storms might come, she and Jack would weather them together. And so, beneath the endless sky, in a home forged from loss and hope, Rose began each day with the same quiet vow: to cherish what remained, to build what was possible, and to greet every dawn with courage and grace.